o'clock on April the 28th. Welcome to our Committee of the Whole agenda for today. We'll go through the roll call first, make sure everybody's here and your mics are working. Councillor Foster? Can't see Councillor Foster here. Councillor Van Leeuwen?
I am here.
Councillor McElwain?
I'm here.
Councillor Kittredge?
Present.
Councillor Dunsmore?
I'm here.
Councillor McCrae?
Here.
And I'm here too. Any disclosure of pecuniary interest with anything under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Okay, seeing none, we'll ask for confirmation of the agenda that the Council of the Township of Centre Wellington confirm the agenda for its meeting held April 28th, 2021. Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Van Leeuwen, seconded by Councillor McCrae. All in favor? And that is carried. One item on our agenda today, and it's a big item, so we thought that we spend a whole meeting just talking about this one item, and rather than tack it on to another council agenda. The Township Operations Center draft report includes a space needs assessment, an evaluation of some alternatives, and then a concept plan. At this point, I will turn it over to Colin initially.
Yep.
Okay. I see you waving at me. That's great. Colin?
All right. Thanks, Mayor Linton. Good afternoon, everyone. Mayor Linton, members of council. On behalf of the project team for the Operations Center project, I'm very pleased to be here today to present the results of the Township Operations Center draft space needs assessment and conceptual design report to council for information today. The report itself contains a lot of information, a lot of analyses. So the project team has prepared a presentation to just provide an overview of the project scope, the options evaluated, the recommended option, and implementation and financial strategies as well for that recommended option. So if you'll bear with us, we have the presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that council may have just at the end of the presentation. If there is a question related to a particular slide, I just ask that council maybe make reference to that slide number, which will allow us to go back to that slide if needed to assist in answering the question. And I think with that, we're going to share screen here and start working through the presentation. Excellent. Okay, there's the opening slide, and maybe we'll go to the next one. Next slide, please.
Just give me 1 second here.
Sure, no problem. So just, yeah, perfect, great, thanks, Adam. So, this project has really been a collaboration between township staff and as well as the consulting team. And I just thought before we got started, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank the internal steering committee, the stakeholders that were involved in this project. There's a whole list of staff that were around the table when we could be around physical tables to kind of work through the number of options and discussions in terms of the operations center space needs assessment. So just wanted to say thank you to the staff involved in the project. Also want to thank the project team, Stephanie and Adam, our new manager of engineering, as well. They've done a ton of work on this project, so just want to thank them for that. And we have on the call today as well our consultant team. So James Makaruk from Sterling Rossi and Jeff Miller from RDH Architects. So they've been assisting us with this process, and they've authored the report in the attachment. And also just a shout out to the senior management team just for their support and guidance throughout the project. Next slide, please. So the project team and consultant team will take turns presenting various sections of the report. So we've got the purpose, the background, an overview of the report, and we have a kind of a high-level implementation plan for that preferred option. And then we'll hand things over to Dan, who will kind of walk us through a financial strategy for the recommended option. And then it'll come back to me for to highlight the next steps of the process. Next slide. So really, the purpose of the report, the purpose is to present the results of the Operations Center draft needs assessment and to Council for information. We've really completed a detailed evaluation of options, looking to house township infrastructure that supports the critical services for the community, whether it be snow plowing, road maintenance, water treatment and supply, maintenance and management of our fleet assets, information technology, parks and tree maintenance, community beautification as well. All these aspects have kind of rolled into this evaluation as part of the space needs assessment. So based on this evaluation, the report does identify a preferred option. And as the township's operations grow in response to the community growth, that's ongoing. So this facility would not just serve us today, but also into the future as well. So I think with that, I will hand things over to Adam Gilmore. Adam's going to provide some background information on the project and some opportunities and constraints associated with our existing facilities. So Adam, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Colin, and very pleased to be here presenting to you today. So I'll give you an overview of our existing operations facilities. So here are some photos showing those facilities. So we have the Fergus East Works Garage, the Pilkington Office, the West Garrett Works Garage, the Pilkington Works Garage, the Elora Works Garage, the Fergus Waterworks, the Parks Barn and Greenhouse, and the IT server room at the Civic Center. And not shown here is the Parks Farmhouse, which is also used as staff office space. So you can see here, our current facilities are spread out across the township in kind of an east-west orientation. And you can see here the various facilities shown on the map. So some of the current deficiencies, constraints that we have at these facilities. So most of the facilities are operating over capacity, so between 100 and 120% of space utilization. The current building designs, the use of space, the flow of employees and vehicles are not efficient or compliant with industry best practices and design trends. The decentralized approach, so this kind of east-west spread, increases total facility operating costs because we have more facilities to operate and maintain. The facilities do not meet requirements under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA, and they have they have health and safety concerns. Washrooms, change rooms, lunch areas are inadequate for staff needs, and we have deferred maintenance and repairs such as roof replacements, garage door replacements, windows, HVAC, yard paving, security, fencing, etc. at these facilities. So I'm going to go through each of the facilities here, highlight some of the deficiencies at each of them. So the Fergus Waterworks facility, so you can see some photos here. So in the first photo on the left, you can see there's an open change room area in the garage base. This is an area that's been kind of retrofitted for change rooms in a mezzanine area. Does not provide adequate privacy for staff. There's a rent trailer on site that's being used as a lunchroom and for touchdown offices. Kind of speaks to the overcapacity issue. And finally, you can see there's an office space here. It was a utility room, but it's been repurposed as an office area. Fergus East. So here's a photo on the left of the garage area that's full of equipment. So the storage is over capacity in the garage. There are no female washrooms or change rooms at this location. And you can see here there have been kind of touchdown workstations that have been added to other areas of the facility. So here's an example in more of a garage kind of work maintenance area where we have a touchdown office. So the Parks Barn, Farmhouse, and Greenhouses. So there are stairs in the facility, so it's not AODA meeting AODA requirements. There's insufficient indoor storage space or vehicles and equipment, so some equipment is left exposed to the elements outdoors. And again, in one of the equipment storage areas here, you can see there's limited space. It's full of equipment. There's no heated area for maintenance during the wintertime, and there's some pretty substantial roof leaks. The IT server facility, which is at the Civic Center. So there's a vault room, which was intended for file storage, which has been repurposed as a server room. The room does not have proper ventilation or fire suppression for electronics. There's not enough space to do proper cable management. And there's not enough space to house all the equipment in a way that allows staff to access areas for maintenance. So you can see here an example of an air conditioning unit with a fan hood that's protruding into the room, makes it tough for staff to get in and access all areas of the room, and it's also a bit of a safety hazard. Pilkington, so the parking area and driveway is used for circulation of heavy equipment, but it's also used as a staff parking area. So have a bit of a safety issue where you have staff kind of walking across the parking area, but you have heavy vehicles kind of traveling through that area also. Admin staff are in repurposed areas of the garage. So this is to accommodate growing staff. And again, this is kind of a common theme you'll see in most of the facilities. We have these steep staircase, no elevator access, so not AODA, meeting AODA requirements. West Garifraxa, we have our file storage and archive area in the basement. It's nearing capacity. In order to add additional capacity, we would have to do major structural modifications to the building. You can see a staircase here, not AODA, not meeting AODA. And finally, a lunch area that does not have the required amenities for staff. In Elora, there's no proper crew meeting room, so there's been an area that's been repurposed for meeting. There's an open staff changing area, no proper male-female employee change rooms and shower facilities, and again, the AODA issue. So to highlight how we're growing, so under Wellington County's official plan, we have growth targets to the 2041 timeframe. So we're going to grow our population employment by approximately 30,000 over the next 20 years. So we're going to need more staff, vehicles, and equipment to maintain our current levels of service for that growing population. So the key point here to summarize, so current facilities are over capacity, not efficient or compliant with industry regulatory standards, and inadequate for staff needs. They're also costly to operate and to maintain. Yeah, so I'm going to turn it back over to Colin to walk us through some of the history related to planning for an operations center.
Great. Thanks, Adam. So post amalgamation, the township inherited a number of operations facilities. This included the ones that Adam has shown in Fergus, Elora, Pilkington, West Garifraxa, and also a garage in Nickel as well. And so kind of post amalgamation, there was a study commissioned by the township that looked at a number of issues, including staffing, resource allocation, but also facilities. And in terms of the operations facilities, the report recommended, and we've got it here in the presentation, the Center Wellington should be aiming for a single operations depot within a 5 to 10 year horizon. And so that report was created just kind of further along in the timeline. 2005, there was a tornado came through the community, as I'm sure many will remember, and the Nickel garage, which was actively being used by the township, was effectively destroyed. And subsequently, the township ended up tearing down the rest of the building and selling the property. Next slide, please. So in terms of capital budgeting for the operations center over the years, kind of that centralized operations facility approach was included in various capital budgets and development charge studies over the years. And in 2018, the project budget was updated, as well as the project understanding. Given the large geographic area of the township, it was determined at that time that satellite facilities to the west and to the east should be maintained with a new facility centrally located in or around Fergus. Specifically we were looking at the Fergus garage site. So this moved us from that previous approach identified in 2004 that basically said we're going to have one facility centralized, likely in Fergus. So that moving from that centralized model to a decentralized model. So that happened in around 2018. And so with that central hub and kind of 2 satellite facilities. This decentralized model will improve efficiency of operations and significantly reduce travel times for operations and maintenance vehicles. During this time too, around 2017, 2018, Parks and Recreation, outside services, information technology, and the archives record storage were added to the project scope too for the new operations facility. And fast forward another year, 2019, we have council passed the strategic plan for the current term of council for 2019 to 2022. And it includes a strategic direction, number 1, initiative 4, which is open a new operations facility. Next slide, please. So that once that was passed, that staff realized that we need to start moving forward with kind of the strategic decisions related to the operations center. And I've got a slide here that just shows typically what the 5 phases to a capital project are. And so really we look at a strategic phase, then there's a concept usually prepared, and then we're into, once the concept is prepared, we're into preliminary design, detailed design, and then construction. There's lots of steps that are kind of in between or following some of those or under those headings, but that's essentially the project phases. And of course, as we get closer to construction through detailed design, we're refining the project scope. We're getting honed in on, a more accurate estimate of the budget. And of course, I would just want to note that we're in the strategic phase still. Like the strategic plan obviously provided us with clear direction, but we really need to understand how, as a network, all of our facilities, will be working together, and overall what the plan will be. So we're still in this strategic phase, and I just want to draw a parallel to some other studies that council would be familiar with that are kind of similar strategic documents, like the water supply master plan, the transportation master plan, and also the asset management plan. Like these are kind of bigger picture strategic documents that have been approved by council that really provide direction to staff on what projects to focus on, what's important to the community, and growing the community's infrastructure. So with council's strategic plan directive of open a new operations facility, we had a lot of work to do to get to that construction phase. So staff prepared a scope of work and a request for proposals to determine operational space needs to house staff, vehicles, and equipment, materials to meet the community's needs to 2041. And so, next slide. So now I'll hand it over to Stephanie and Adam. Steph will describe the project scope for the space needs assessment and concept design. And Adam will present the constraints around the Fergus garage site at 600 Glengarry.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks. Yes, so we pulled together a request for proposals for the space needs assessment and concept design study, and that was issued to consultants in June 2019. And that was based on some key assumptions. One of the primary assumptions being that we would be demolishing the existing Fergus East Works garage and using that existing site at 600 Glengarry Crescent in Fergus as the location of the new shop and offices for the project. So we had basically earmarked Fergus East for demolition because as we saw in some of the information Adam went through, Fergus East has several deficiencies. It does not comply with the accessibility requirements. It is very overcrowded. And it's also one of our older facilities. It's approaching 50 years old now. And because of all of those issues that are ongoing with that garage, it really is nearing the end of its useful service life. So it was earmarked for demolition with a thought that that existing site could be the location of the new shop and an office facility. That existing 600 Glengarry site is about 13.5 acres in size, and it has a creek actually running through the property. That creek is bordered by an environmental protection zone, which has an area of approximately 5.5 acres. And that leaves approximately 8 acres remaining. And with those 8 acres, there's a large portion of that was actually historically used as fill. That fill area is not very conducive to building on, at least not in a cost-effective manner. And so once you kind of deduct the environmental protection area and you deduct the fill area, you're really left with a usable area for cost-effective construction of about 2.5 acres at that Glengarry site. So the main goal of this study was really to look at including space for multiple departments, those being Public Works, Engineering, Water Services, Parks, Recreation and Forestry, Source Water Protection, and Information Technology. And the new facility was intended to accommodate the staff from all of those multiple departments. But as well as having staff, office space, and garage areas, we knew we needed it also to accommodate all the vehicles and equipment for operations, outdoor material storage areas, as well as indoor storage, record storage, archives area, and of course, parking on the site for staff and for visitors. So all of those uses needed to be addressed in the new facility. And we wanted the facility not just to meet only our current needs, but we wanted it to be able to accommodate us well into the future. So we looked at including growth for staff, vehicles, and equipment for all of those items to the 20-year time frame, basically to bring us out to the year 2041. So that this would be a facility not just for our current needs, but it would help, bring us well forwards into 20 years down the road. It would be able to continue accommodating our uses. Part of the study was also, as Colin was pointing out, to continue using some of our existing facilities as satellite facilities, those that are positioned kind of to the further east and west ends of the township, out in the West Garifaxa garages and the Laura garage as well, to service satellite facilities to help minimize crew travel times. So the sort of overall approach was to develop a centralized main facility to accommodate the multiple departments, but then to also have satellite facilities to cover the further extremities of the township and in that approach to help maximize efficiencies. So the main objective of the space needs assessment and concept design study was to identify the facility requirements to accommodate the multiple departments of Public Works, Water Services, Engineering, Parks, Recreation and Forestry, Source Water Protection, and IT, and to find the space requirements for all of those staff and operations, including records and materials storage, archives areas, vehicles and equipment storage, maintenance of vehicles, to have all of that on one centralized site, on one centralized facility, and to incorporate growth in staff, vehicles and equipment to the 20-year time frame. So once we could identify those space needs requirements, then we had to, work through coming up with the options for, well, how do we provide those space needs? What's the best, or what are several possible solutions to look at? And then we had to then evaluate those options and kind of see which ones are coming out ahead. This whole exercise really gave us a very good opportunity to be able to look at the bigger picture in order to improve the current and future delivery of township services by identifying and implementing an operating solution in order to maximize the function and efficiency of staff, facilities, equipment, and other resources. So really our main goal was to develop that central facility idea and concept, to have it be able to accommodate multiple departments, for the long-term time frame, in order to improve collaboration between different departments and help maximize efficiencies. And with that, I will turn it back over to Adam to take us through the next few slides.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephanie. So in July 2019, we awarded RFP 1819 to Sterling Rossi Consulting and RDHA Architects to prepare a space needs assessment and conceptual design report. From September to November 2019, so we looked through the analysis. We determined that the 600 Glengarry site was not going to be sufficient for the construction of a new operation facility that would meet our needs. So Stephanie already mentioned, we identified there was a substantial amount of unusable fill at the rear of the property that was unsuitable for building. And that, coupled with the GRCA regulated area on site, the site is actually reduced to about between 2 and 3 usable acres for building. This would leave us no opportunity for future expansion. We would not be able to construct a new, larger sand salt storage facility. So we would really be constrained on this site. So the preliminary recommendation through the study was not to build a new facility at the 600 Glengarry site, and instead to consider other options, including looking at potentially a 20-acre site. So just to illustrate the issue here on this site and how it's constrained. So you can see a map here showing the GRCA regulated area, also showing that fill area. And I should also note, this site is located within a wellhead protection area for source water protection, and there could be additional constraints for some of the site activities like salt storage and fuel storage. It might be subject to risk management measures. So we did a very preliminary high-level conceptual layout for that site. And what we found was that the building that we could fit on that site is not large enough. It will not meet our needs to 2041. Would not include a salt storage facility, pole barns, greenhouses, all these facilities that we need. It would also be very expensive to construct, given the need to prepare that fill area for construction. So then in December 2019, there were some new options or ideas that were discussed at the council budget meeting. So expanding existing facilities, coordinating the opportunity to coordinate perhaps with a county facility. And then finally, utilizing the Queen Street medical offices. So the Queen Street medical office building in Fergus is owned and operated by the township. That building has been vacated by the doctors and medical staff that previously occupied the building. So there is an opportunity to use that space for staff office space, township staff office space. So we wanted to also consider that in our analysis. So our scope of work was expanded to consider these options. Between January and March of 2020, 8 options were developed. Between March and December of 2020, the project was put on hold temporarily due to COVID-19. And then in January, March of this year, the project was picked back up, and we subjected the 8 options to a detailed evaluation and came up with a preliminary recommended option. So we completed for that preliminary recommended option, we completed a concept design, an implementation plan, and a financing plan that we're going to walk you through later in the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James McCarrick of Sterling Rossi, who is our technical lead and consultant on the project, and he's going to walk us through the technical analysis. So James, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Adam. And let me begin by saying that I'm very pleased to be participating today and would certainly like to bring to everyone's attention, the hard work that has certainly been evident from staff over the last year and a half, and in particular, those people who are speaking today, including Stephanie, Adam, and Colin. So I guess bringing our perspective as the consultants brought on board to help, we consist really of two firms. The firm I'm from, Sterling Rossi Consulting, and also in association with us, RDH Architects, and the lead architect from RDH Architects will be speaking as part of our presentation this afternoon, Jeff Miller. So our mandate was to come and first make sure we understood what the problem was and the opportunity that would come from that problem. And the problem has to a large extent been well discussed already this afternoon, but I thought I would go through it and try to summarize it in 3 key points right now, and then talk about the opportunity that's presented as a result. The problem as we see it really threefold. First of all, many of the garages are already at or exceeding capacity. This will become even worse in the coming years as the township continues to expand in population and the need for additional resources by the different operations departments increases. Certainly the number of employees, the number of vehicles, the equipment, the materials which they're handling, all of that is going to continue to increase in order to meet growing service level requirements. Secondly, the decentralized approach that exists right now with a number of different works garages spread out across the township does present some problems. Typically, having this decentralized approach has a negative impact on employee collaboration, and it also minimizes the extent to which you can achieve synergies between these different departments. And then thirdly, these work garages, many of them are quite old. I think the oldest one was built in the 1950s. Certainly they were all designed for a different process, a different number of employees. All of that has changed, which is to be expected over a number of decades. So these facilities now are in poor condition. They're largely being used for purposes they weren't initially intended to be able to achieve. They aren't necessarily complying with building codes, accessibility requirements, and many of these issues have been pointed out earlier by Adam and I believe Stephanie. And certainly they don't represent modern best practices in operations design. We certainly have a better, keener sense today than ever before on how best to provide efficient facilities to allow the employees who are working within these facilities to work safely, to work at their optimum efficiency level, to be able to collaborate with one another, and to include these different synergies that I mentioned earlier between departments working together. So with that in mind, what we really understand the opportunity to be from this problem is the ability to move forward and figure out how best to satisfy this need for more space over the coming years, and to ensure that we are providing a safe work environment, one that improves employee morale and their motivation levels to work safely and effectively. Next slide. So our approach is highlighted in this slide and the following slide, and I'll just touch on them very quickly right now, but the remainder of my presentation will be to go in and focus on these different elements of our approach. So really we began having understood the problem and the opportunity to then move forward to develop a space needs assessment. We then looked at up to 8 different options for being able to achieve the space needs assessment. We then also looked at how best to compare these different options and to rank them versus one another to identify what the preferred option would be. Next slide. Having identified a preferred option, we then moved forward with a more detailed space program and a high-level conceptual site plan layout. We also looked at other municipal operation facilities that have been built in recent years, some by RDH architects, and Jeff Miller being the lead architect for those facilities as well. And he can speak to some of the highlights of those facilities later on in this presentation. And then lastly, we prepared a draft 10-year implementation plan that would give a sense of some of the revenues and costs that would be required over that period of time as the township moves forward. Next slide. So I mentioned that really our first key step in our approach was to complete a space needs assessment. This really began by reviewing the current facilities and talking with a very large group of staff to understand their operations and their current needs for space and other functional requirements. We also, and Stephanie pointed this out earlier, we also had to look into the future. Typically for a project like this, you look out to a 20-year time horizon and understand what the size of the operation will likely be at that point in time. And then you start developing a space program around that point in time, really just to ensure that any new facility that's built is obviously not going to be too small the day it's actually completed. And unfortunately, that does still happen every now and then. But we will certainly avoid that. So we also then looked at comparing the current facilities with best practices in facility design, looking for opportunities to optimize the use of space, to achieve synergies between different departments, to bring in the opportunity for collaboration amongst employees, and to ultimately address the problem that I spoke of earlier and to achieve the opportunity. Next slide. So I mentioned that as part of the approach, after having completed the space needs assessment, we then wanted to develop a number of different options on how best to move forward to achieve the space needs assessment, to achieve the opportunity that is presented to us. Of these 8 options, the first one is the benchmark. It is the do nothing approach. That's always an option, not necessarily a good one, but it was our option number 1. The other 7 options, though, were all intended to try to address the problem, to achieve what needed to be achieved, to eliminate all of the issues that Stephanie, Adam, and even Colin have already discussed today in our presentation. So I'll go through these other 7 options very quickly here to give you a sense of what they are. I want everyone to recognize up front that some of these options are similar to others, and that there's a fine difference between some of them, but all of them were meant to try to look at all of the different possible ways to best move forward. So option 2 was to really just limit the initial new construction to a new works garage on one of the existing sites. And this works garage would be limited in size to really just satisfy the needs of the infrastructure services group who would be occupying that site. Any additional space requirements would have to be built at other garages to meet the growing space requirements for these other employees at these other sites. Option 3 was to say, well, look, is there an opportunity for us to team up with another entity? In this case, we looked at the County of Wellington. Could we team up with them to share some costs, achieve some synergies between the two groups in the construction of a combined operations center? We found out very quickly that the concern with that option was that the county wasn't prepared to look at building a new operations center for another 15 years. And so that presented a serious problem, which is what should the township do for the next 15 years as they are going to continue to run short of space and have operational issues as a result. Option 4, like option 2, was to build a new garage, but this time to include administrative office space at this one current site, 600 Glengarry. And it would also still be for the current infrastructure services group. And that would mean then that additional space would have to be added on to some of the other works garages to meet the other additional space requirements. Next slide. So options, the remaining options 5 through 8 really have a common element to them. And that common element is that they all believe the township should move forward in building a new operations center, one that would have to be on a new site because, as has been pointed out previously, none of the existing sites are large enough or in the right general location to be able to accommodate this new operations center. So what really differentiates these remaining 4 options is the number of phases that would be required to complete the construction over the next 20 years. And in fact, as we move from option 5 through 8, the general principle is that we're delaying a greater portion of the construction to a later date, really with the objective of trying to further reduce the upfront construction cost and therefore to make it more affordable right now for the township to move forward with the phase 1 of construction. Next slide. These slides, they outline here the different phases. I won't go through and read these different details, but I will come back to this in some later slides that we get to more carefully flesh out the differences between these options. So, next slide. So to evaluate the different options, we really looked at identifying 3 key categories: financial, operational, and technical design. And for each of those 3 categories, we came up with very specific criteria that would be used to compare the 8 options. We also looked at a weighting factor for each one of the criteria that would help prioritize these criteria based on the importance to the township. Next slide. So on this slide and the following slide, we have a table that more clearly shows these 3 different categories: the operational, technical design, and operational categories, and these different criteria. So I'll go through, I'll highlight what each of them is, and you'll see in the last column the weighting factor that has been applied to each one of these criteria. The weighting factor being between 0 and 10, well, I guess 1 and 10 really. So the first criteria under operational is the ability of the option to satisfy the 20-year growth and operational needs. Obviously, a critical, important issue. That's why it has a weighting factor of 10 out of 10. The second criteria, does the option have the ability to incorporate best practices in facility design? And there we applied a factor of 8 out of 10. Third criteria, does the option have the ability to achieve short-term urgent needs? Those can't be forgotten because the township really is already short of space. The township can't wait another 10, 15 years to start trying to address those space requirements. Then the fourth criteria here, how does the phasing affect staff? Obviously, as the phasing would take place and staff might have to be relocated to different locations during construction, it's going to have a detrimental impact on productivity. We applied a weighting factor there of 6 out of 10. Moving to the technical design category, the first criteria was, to what extent does the option comply with legislative requirements, building codes, standards, accessibility, and equality issues? Because these are legislated, we gave this a weighting factor of 10 out of 10. The next criteria was the extent to which the option satisfies environmental and sustainability standards. We don't anticipate that the new facility would be designed to a LEED standard per se, or certainly wouldn't be out looking for LEED certification, but certainly there are different components of sustainability that would be looked at and determined to be, in all likelihood, reasonable and a good idea to proceed with. And we put that as a weighting factor of 4 out of 10. Next slide. So finally, to the financial category, 2 criteria. First one, to what extent does the option minimize the initial capital construction cost? A weighting of 8 out of 10. And then secondly, and lastly, to what extent does the option minimize the overall capital cost of the project over the lifespan of the construction, whether that be 10 or even 20 years? And because it's the total cost, we gave that the highest weighting of 10 out of 10. Okay, next slide. I think Stephanie, you're gonna bring that up. There we go. So we really went through a rigorous process, part of which I've been describing here, to try to evaluate and compare these 8 different options. You can see a table here that helps to identify the score that we came up with for each criteria for each option. I'm going to go through and really highlight some of the key points for our conclusions for each one of these options. First of all, option 1, to do nothing. This option had the lowest overall score and ranked lowest out of all of the options, which I think can be expected. Certainly, it's what we expected from day one. The reason it scored poorly was because continuing with the current overcrowded works garages will continue to result in inefficient operations. Staff won't be able to meet immediate needs, and we won't be able to solve the space requirements that are becoming worse and worse with each coming year. This option received a 0 score for at least half of the criteria, since these existing works garages have many deficiencies, which we've been pointing out already, and don't comply with best practices for design. They don't comply with building code requirements in some cases, and accessibility requirements. So this option really, it doesn't solve the problem, and that's, I guess, the bottom line. The only criteria in which this option scored well was in terms of cost, which can be expected because it's the do nothing option. We tried not to spend money, and really we're only going to spend money where absolutely necessary to continue to maintain the structures. Moving on to option 2, which is to build a new garage only for the current infrastructure services group at one of the existing facilities, and to modify other buildings at other works garages to continue to meet space requirements over the next 20 years. This option was ranked 4th lowest, but had a relatively low overall score of 54%. It scored fairly well, though, at meeting short-term needs and complying with building code requirements, since the new garages would be modified in some way to address the current requirements for the infrastructure services staff. However, the new garage wouldn't provide administrative office space or address the needs of multiple other departments. The existing facilities would continue to be out of compliance with industry best practices and standards, and would be inefficient in terms of vehicle and employee flow. So this option had low scores for the criteria that looked at those issues. Although renovations of the existing facilities would help, the improvements would be limited by the constraints of the existing buildings and the various site limitations as well. The renovation and expansion of some of the existing facilities would disrupt work of staff and delivery of services. So this option generally received a low score for the criteria that looked at those issues. The option did score fairly well, though, on cost criteria, since it had a relatively low initial cost and the second lowest overall cost. Option 3, as I said earlier, was to really look at teaming up with the county. Now, this would be about 15 years from now, but a joint operations center would be built with them. But in the meantime, to meet the growing space requirements, additions and renovations would be needed at existing work garages and offices. So this option ranked 2nd lowest and had a fairly low score of 48%. It had the lowest score of 0 for the overall cost because it was, in the end, the most expensive of all of the options, since it included not only the cost for a new combined operations center, but also extensive renovations and additions to existing facilities to keep them operational and meeting the space requirements in the interim over the next 15 plus years. The numerous additions and renovations would be disruptive to work, far more so than most of the other options that we looked at. So this option had the lowest score in terms of its impact on staff productivity. The existing facilities would continue to be out of compliance with industry best practices in layout design and would be relatively inefficient. So this option had relatively low scores when looking at those issues, those criteria. The renovations and expansions to the existing facilities would help their compliance, but improvements would be limited by their existing building and site constraints. Option 3 had relatively high scores for meeting the space needs and complying with building codes, since the new combined operations center, when finally built 15 years down the road, would address those criteria. Option 4, similar to option 2, would be to build a new garage, but to be slightly larger than the one with option 2, because it would include an administrative office. It would be at the 600 Glengarry site, but it would only really address the needs of the infrastructure services group. So additional space would need to be built at the other existing garages and offices. This option was ranked third lowest and had a fairly low overall score of 48%. It scored fairly well, however, at meeting the needs and complying with code, since the new garage that would be built at one of the existing sites would address current requirements for the infrastructure services operation and would also meet code compliance. However, it wouldn't be large enough to satisfy the space requirements for the other departments that are growing short of space. The existing facilities would continue to be out of compliance with industry best practices and standards, and would be inefficient in terms of the flow of people and vehicles. So this option had low scores for the criteria that looked at those issues. Although the renovations of the existing facilities would help, the improvements would be limited once again by the constraints of these buildings, the fact that many of them were built several decades ago, and the site limitations. The renovation and expansion of several of the existing buildings would in fact disrupt the operations staff, who would have to be largely continuing to work during the construction from these facilities. The last four options, options 5 through 8, as I said earlier, are really quite similar in that all four of them are recommending moving forth with the construction of a new operations center and on a new site. Therefore, they received similar scores within a fairly narrow range. They were also the highest ranking options. Each of these options did in fact address the problem, and that is largely why they received the highest scores. The operations center that would be built for each of these options would be designed to satisfy best practices in layout design, would certainly satisfy building code requirements and standards, accessibility requirements, would address the opportunity to achieve synergies between departments to optimize the utilization of space and permit the different groups to collaborate better with one another, sharing of equipment and materials where appropriate. Where these options differed, though, was the upfront construction cost and the time required to implement the different phases of construction, and therefore the time required to satisfy the problem that we're trying to address with this study. As the construction of the operations center is delayed over a number of years, there are certainly more disruptions to staff as well, as they have to find interim measures to meet their growing space requirements. This is disruptive. It's also, in some cases, costly. I'll just go through and I guess define what options 5, 6, 7, and 8 are quickly. So option 5 then really is characterized as the option that would try to, for the most part, build the operations center all at once upfront. Option 6 would now start to look at ways to decrease the upfront construction cost and make it a bit more affordable. So the operations center would be built in 2 phases. In phase 1, really all of the garage or all of the operations center would be built, with the exception of some of the garage space for the storage of vehicles and materials. Instead of building that all in phase 1, it would be deferred to phase 2. And in the interim, these vehicles would need to continue to be stored at the other existing works garages, which adds a level of complexity because you're now scattering people and vehicles around the township rather than pulling them all together, consolidating them and achieving the synergies and benefits of doing so up front. Option 7 like option 6, is relying on phasing, but even more phasing than option 6 to make it more affordable up front. So with phase 1 of option 7, there would be building of the garage for just the immediate needs, but rather than building an office, the township would look at using the medical office when it becomes available as interim office space for a number of years until that office component could be built at the operations center in phase 2, along with additional garage space for vehicles, equipment, and materials. So it's a more affordable option than option 6 up front, but I think ultimately over the long term, it's probably as a total cost becoming more expensive. Option 8 is to build really just the garage for immediate needs, and then in phase 2, build the full office. And then in phase 3, add on additions to it for the different garage storage space requirements, salt storage facility, and greenhouse. I think we can go to the next slide now. So this slide really is just a summary of the evaluation results, and you can see fairly quickly, fairly easily, how each option ranked with regards to one another and what the costs were in terms of the phase 1 upfront cost, as well as the total project cost for construction and land by the end of total completion. And what you'll see here is, and I guess go to the next slide, is that options 1 to 4 scored the lowest. Options 5 to 8, the highest, and within a relatively narrow range, between 65 and 72% were the scores for these top scoring options. And so really what that narrow range tells us is that although the best solution is to build a new operations center on a new site using a phased approach, the details of how that phasing takes place is perhaps not so critical. Perhaps those details can be figured out later on, and what really needs to be taken into consideration is affordability. So the phasing can be designed in such a way as to optimize the ability of the township to afford the upfront cost and to get the project going. Of these 8 options, option 6 was identified as the highest scoring option, therefore the preferred option. And with that in mind, then, we moved forward through the study, looking more closely at option 6. Next slide, please. So option 6, I've talked about it earlier, but just to give you a better description, now that we've identified it as the preferred option. So option 6 would be divided into 2 phases. Phase 1 would consist of building the full office for all of the office requirements for the next 20 years, as well as employee amenities, meaning lunchroom, changing rooms, washrooms, and so forth, as well as the shops and the maintenance bays, the vehicle maintenance bays. Some garage space would be built for immediate needs for vehicle storage, but otherwise, those space requirements would be met for the interim by utilizing space at existing works garages. And there would be 1 new greenhouse built in phase 1. Phase 2, when money becomes available, would be built. And at that time, the remaining garage bays would be added on, and a new greenhouse and salt storage building. And once this building then is complete, it would mean that many of the other works garages would no longer be required and could in fact be utilized for other purposes or even disposed of, with perhaps the exception of at least one or two of the works garages, which would have a longer term benefit as satellite facilities. Next slide. So here is a quick summary of the space program for option 6. What you'll see in the left-hand side, the left column would be the different functional areas of the operations center. And as you move to the right, you can see the area that would be required in phase 1 for each of those functional areas. And then in phase 2, in the far column, the additional space that would be built to achieve the full build out. So you can see here that in phase 1 of option 6, the objective would be to build a facility of approximately 37,000 square feet in phase 1, and then an additional 17,500 square feet would be built in phase 2. In total, this operations center would be 54,600 square feet when complete. Yep. Okay, good. So for option 6, in terms of our analysis, and Jeff, who I'll be introducing here very briefly, we'll talk about this further, but we really identified the need for a new site that would really be a minimum of 20 acres. More would be better. I would certainly recommend buying more if the money and appropriate site is available, but I think a minimum of 20 is required. And this should be able to meet the needs of the township really for at least the next 60 years. And we picked 60 because typically that's the lifespan of a new facility. Additional space may be required, as I said earlier, but because we haven't picked out a site yet, we don't know exactly what that site will look like, what its limitations might be in terms of topography or potentially a water course or other areas of it that might be restricted for building purposes. So all of those issues will have to be considered when looking at different sites to purchase. So that brings my part to an end. I'm going to introduce now Jeff Miller, a principal at RDH Architects and the lead architect on this project. Jeff?
Thank you, James. And thank you, everyone attending today, for giving us this chance to review our work with you. As James mentioned, our office, RDH Architects, worked with him and the township's team, and we were responsible, RDH Architects was responsible for using the information gathered and just described over the past few minutes to develop a site plan, a sort of conceptual generic site plan for the purpose of understanding how much space is needed to meet the current requirements, as well as 20 plus years of growth. James already stated that we ended up concluding that 20 acres is appropriate. And what we're going to show in these plans is sort of how we arrived there and what that really means in terms of planning an operations center. Before I go into the details of this drawing, I'll just mention that our office has designed roughly 8 or 9, I think, operations centers and works yards over the past decade, and they varied quite a bit in size and budget, mostly in Southern Ontario. And so we've learned a lot about current planning best practices for those types of facilities. We spent hundreds of hours in conversation with both administrative workers, indoor and outdoor staff as well, and observing them in action. So we've applied all those principles to this plan. Now, as I mentioned, this is a generic site, and the proportions could be altered to suit any specific conditions. The lower third of the plan with most of the green space there is the area that would be fronting on the street at the bottom edge of the page and would be the sort of public facing side of the site. Everything on the top 2/3 or so, the large paved area, would be the secure fenced in works yard itself. The areas in white are buildings that would be part of phase 1. The phase 2 structures are dashed in, and we'll kind of get a better sense of those as we zoom in on some of the parts of this. And vehicle movements around the yard are also shown as dashed lines. Next slide, please. So if we look more closely at the main operations building, it's laid out as an L, which functionally is very useful because it helps us divide it into 2 wings, one for the administrative functions at the bottom edge of the page with all the offices and staff amenities, such as a lunchroom and change rooms, as well as meeting and training spaces. And then a more industrial wing that is within the works yard, running north-south, right in the center of the page. And that will contain all of our service spaces, as well as workshops and yard-related storage spaces, so storage of vehicles and equipment. The other nice things about this plan strategy are that it gives views from the administration area into the yard, and it provides a single secure internal checkpoint between the front of house and the back of house functions. So you can easily kind of control access. And it provides easy expansion at both sides. So the workshop wing can expand to the north, as shown with the dashed rectangle at the top, which indicates later phase expansion. And the administrative wing can expand to the west, what we'll call west in this generic plan. Next slide, please. Looking more at the overall works yard plan, fleet vehicle movements, as I mentioned, are indicated as these dashed lines, and those are planned as much as possible as one-way loops and a counterclockwise configuration. We've just found that those are seen as much safer movements in a works yard, as left turns are safer for larger vehicles, especially vehicles such as plows with wing blades, where right-hand visibility is very restricted. And we've mapped out most of the typical daily activities that would take place, in this works yard. So those would include things like driving in and out of the vehicle storage and maintenance bays in the building, loading salt and sand at the indoors in the salt and sand shed that would be part of phase 2, and that's the heavy dashed rectangle at the upper left of the page. Loading various materials and equipment around different parts of the yard. Those are indicated in some of the some of the labels, such as topsoil, gravel, various vehicle attachments and things like that. Fueling and other kind of miscellaneous activities. Next slide, please. And then in the south portion of the site, you see the main parking area, the staff vehicle parking area. An important feature of this plan is that there's no private vehicles entering the works yard itself. So this parking lot would accommodate roughly 78 vehicles, including 60 staff, as well as 16 visitors and the required barrier-free, and would allow for additional parking expansion of that same amount again in a future phase. Excuse me. The small white building at the upper left is a greenhouse, and there's room to the south of that for additional greenhouse space in a future phase, as well as outdoor plant storage just to the left of those buildings for new trees and other plants. And there's some adjacent parking for loading in and out of the greenhouse and plant storage areas. The other key kind of planning feature is having 2 site entries. That's important because, one, to have kind of this one-way directional flow around the site as much as possible, but also if one of the entries becomes blocked by, say, a broken down vehicle or a material spill, the other one is available for both entry and exit. Next slide, please. So summing up, this plan gives us a really good visual validation of how much space the operations center requires. It clearly demonstrated to us that the Fergus East site is not viable in terms of the amount of space, and therefore 20 acres at a minimum should be purchased. Next slide, please. So we'll spend just a few moments looking at some examples of facilities from other municipalities, both some basic statistics here as well as some photographs. So these 6 projects were all built in the last decade, most of them just in the last few years, all in Southern Ontario, mostly in this region. And 2 of these are projects I'm intimately familiar with as our office designed them, the City of Quinte Operations Center and the Town of Halton Hills. And those happen to represent a fairly high and low end of the overall cost and size spectrum shown here. Obviously, there's a lot of variation, and there are many variables that we can't really clearly break down here because it gets very complex. So these aren't perfect apples to apples comparisons, but they do give a good sense of the range of what to expect in terms of size and cost. Some of the variables that would affect cost and size include the fact that smaller buildings tend to cost more per square foot, which makes sense with economies of scale. The different programs in these buildings can make a big difference. So cheaper space to build will drive down the cost per square foot, and cheaper space would typically include things like indoor vehicle storage, where the space may be minimally heated and quite basic in its construction, and cost a lot less than an office or a sophisticated workshop space. And so some buildings, like for instance, the City of Quinte Operations Center, contain a very large proportion of indoor minimally heated storage space, which brings down cost proportionally. Buildings with post-disaster facilities or emergency operations centers, which are often included with municipal operations centers, will cost more. The site size is not necessarily always indicative of the exact program needs. Some sites were limited, severely limited in some cases by circumstance, and others had a lot of room for growth on sites that were already owned. The amount of paving and other yard development is related to that fact, and the amount of paving by itself can greatly affect cost. And then finally, construction escalation over time has a big effect as well. So based on this chart, what we see here and our own extensive experience, we believe that the assumed cost of $300 a square foot for this project represents a reasonable working assumption for a new facility that meets current, i.e. modern, functional, and quality standards in a cost-efficient manner. Next slide, please. Here we see just a few examples, and on the next couple of pages, of some of these facilities. In particular, these 3 were part of that chart we just saw. The Town of East Gwillimbury Operations Center. I don't know much about this facility, but it is just opening this spring, so it was just completed. The 2 on the bottom were finished in the last 4 years or so, and they were by our office in the city of Quinte and Halton Hills. As I mentioned before, a very large one in Quinte and a much smaller facility in Halton Hills. Next slide, please. And some of these photos, we hoped to give you a sense of just the kind of look and feel of what is typical in this type of building nowadays. They look very different than they did 50 years ago. The expectations, the level of, the kind of level of finish and sophistication, and particularly of a lot of the workshop spaces, has by necessity increased over time. On the upper left, you see a vehicle storage area, very simple kind of shed space. Upper right is a typical staff cafeteria, then a staff change area, and boardroom. Next slide, please. These were all from some of the buildings that my office designed. Upper left here is an electrical workshop. To its right, typical administrative office space with a view out to the works yard. A salt and sand facility. This was a particularly large one in the city of Brampton. And also from the Brampton Operations Center, the Williams Parkway Operations Center is their vehicle repair and maintenance facility. And I'll just mention in relation to these photos that these kind of illustrate some of the aspects of current operation centers that are sort of current best practices in terms of design. I would say those things include better quality, safer workspaces than you would have seen a generation ago, particularly in terms of the safety standards of workshops and the yard layouts, but also in amenities such as lunchrooms and change rooms, which contribute to happier, healthier, and more productive staff. There's generally more storage of vehicles indoors on the understanding that that greatly extends asset life and is ultimately a very wise investment. As I've kind of mentioned, the maintenance garages and other workshops have become more complex with more specialized requirements and systems. And there's usually a lot of planning for future expansion built into these facilities. That brings me to the end of my portion, and I'll pass it back to Township. Thank you.
So I will speak to the high-level implementation plan, and thank you, Jeff and James, for all of that very useful information that you walked us through. So the implementation plan is developed based on option 6, seen as option 6 was the highest scoring option and the one that we sort of delved into the details further. So I should point out that this is a very high-level conceptual implementation plan. It basically gives us one representative example of the next steps of how this project could unfold over the next sort of 10 to 20 year time frame. There is a lot of flexibility in the implementation of this plan, and however we may choose to progress with those next steps with direction of council, we can certainly tailor that to suit our requirements. So walking through how we could achieve phase 1 of option 6 of the new operations center over a time frame of approximately 5 years, perhaps. One of the important first steps would be to determine the initial site, like go through a site selection process, identify potential sites, do an evaluation, have a recommended option, take that to council, and seek direction for the purchase of the property. Once the new operations center site was obtained, we would need to do the necessary background studies and investigations, for the site development and site plan approval process, things like geotechnical investigation, site surveys, traffic impact assessments, looking at the environmental considerations, all of those sorts of things, they would need to be investigated and determined as part of the background information that's necessary when you proceed with the further detailed design steps. And we would then have to, once we obtained all the information that we needed for the background investigations, we could proceed with the detailed design for phase 1 of the construction. And that being for option 6 in particular, we would be looking at constructing the immediate garage areas, the garage areas for our immediate needs, I should say, and as well as the full office build out to accommodate staff for the 20-year time frame, and 1 initial greenhouse. And in conjunction with just building the garage areas for immediate needs, we would also be continuing to use our existing works garage facilities for storage of some vehicles and equipment off-site. In particular, kind of looking at the seasonal equipment, things like snow plows, they could be more efficiently stored off-site in the off-season of summer when we are not using them, and taking advantage of the off-site storage while our initial garage construction area is to help minimize that, basically. And then to move ahead with phase 2 of the construction for option 6 in about a 10 to sort of 20-year time frame, we would do whatever additional studies or investigations were required. We would proceed with the detailed design of phase 2, and of course obtain the required permits and approvals for that. And then we would be able to proceed with the construction of the phase 2 of option 6, which we've kind of identified as being the additions to the garage spaces, both heated and unheated, as well as the new indoor salt storage facility and an additional greenhouse. And at any point during the implementation of phases 1 and 2, we could look at selling some of the existing township properties to help finance portions of those phases of the construction, kind of at the discretion and direction of council. So next slide, thanks. So as we step through the different years, the implementation plan here is really just focusing on the first 10 years. That being said, it can be expanded to a 20-year implementation. There's a lot of flexibility with that. So this chart also gives us the estimated costs, and I should explain that these are very high-level cost estimates at this initial conceptual stage. And these estimated costs, in addition to construction costs, they also include the land purchase for the new site, as well as the required soft costs for things like the various consulting fees, the design for engineering, legal requirements, as well as things like staff relocation, moving costs, furniture, computer communications, all of those costs, as well as potentially needing to renovate interim office space. We can see there in year 1, we've got an item for having staff temporarily housed in the medical office, which would need to be renovated from its current doctor's office kind of layout in order to accommodate staff from the township temporarily until the new office at the operations center could be constructed in perhaps like the 3 to 4 kind of year time frame. So also in year 1, we have the site selection and approvals process, and releasing the request for proposal for the detailed design and tender and contract admin for phase 1 of the operations center. And then in year 2, we would move ahead with those background studies that I had talked about, move ahead through the site plan development and site plan approvals process, and proceed with actually doing the detailed design of phase 1, and at the same time also doing the conceptual design of phase 2, so that we make sure that what we're doing in phase 1 is going to work with phase 2 once we get to the point where phase 2 can be implemented. Then in year 3, we could then move ahead with actually releasing the tender for phase 1 of the operations center and proceeding with the construction of the garage for the immediate use, and the full office build out for 20-year projections, and the initial greenhouse. And that cost is estimated at about 11 million for the construction and detailed work of implementing phase 1. And then in year 4, hopefully phase 1 would be all constructed and staff could actually then move into the new operations center and start using the new facility. Our next big milestones after that are really the detailed design for phase 2 and the construction tender of phase 2, and then actually building the phase 2 construction. And we have that shown in years 9 and 10 currently, but there's certainly a lot of flexibility as to when exactly that could be implemented. And we're showing a cost estimate in the range of 10 million for the phase 2 work. And I should also point out that these costs do not reflect any potential revenue from the sale of any of the existing township properties. So that's not shown here. And I believe that Dan will talk more about that as he leads us through his financial analysis section.
Thank you, Stephanie. Just going on to the financial strategy. We've broken down the financial strategy into the 2 different phases, with phase 1 happening between 21 and 24, and then phase 2 beyond the 10-year mark. We're showing approximately 16.45 million for phase 1 and 10.627 million for phase 2. This includes estimates for land acquisition, the construction costs, as well as any soft costs related to construction and the overall project. Again, keep in mind that, as was mentioned a few times in the presentation today, we are still in the strategic or conceptual stage of this project, and this would be further refined as you get into preliminary design and detailed design. In terms of the growth-related portion of the project, we did include a provision for operations facility space in the most recently approved development charges background study. In terms of the specific calculations, we're showing that approximately 93% of phase 1 would be growth-related, and 62% of phase 2 would be growth-related. And that's taking into account a number of different variables, including the fact that we need to acquire land for both phase 1 and phase 2. We have some ineligible services going into the facility that are ineligible to be funded through development charges. Services like IT and records management are obviously impacted by growth, but the Development Charges Act does not allow us to fund facility space associated with those services through development charges. Also, this accounts for anything considered non-growth related. And when you're dealing with facility space in a development charge study, if you're replacing existing square footage with new square footage, that square footage is considered non-growth. So we've taken all of that into account to establish the 93% for phase 1 and 62% for phase 2. And we have excluded the medical center renovation or relocation costs as part of this. That's another cost that would not be eligible for DC funding. On this next slide, we're looking at the funding associated with those cost increases. So we're showing phase 1 and phase 2. The growth related costs of this project, 93% for phase 1, 62% for phase 2, we're showing to be funded through growth related debt. What that means is we can use development charges to fund the principal and interest associated with that debt. of roughly 15.3 million for phase 1 and 6.5 million for phase 2. I've included a brief sensitivity analysis at the bottom of the screen showing both 20 and 25-year term debt at 3 and 4% interest annually. And I've used the highest figures of 20-year term over 4% interest as part of the sensitivity analysis, just to remain conservative. So that means principal and interest payments of roughly 1.1 million in phase 1 and 480,000 in phase 2. I've also included the non-growth share of the project being funded strictly from the sale of surplus property. That would mean that from a construction perspective, this facility would not have an impact on taxation or impact on water and wastewater rates, which are the two major funding sources that would be operating out of this building. It does mean identifying and discussing further with council what that existing surplus property may be, and we envision that being a future discussion with council once we move beyond this strategic conceptual phase of the project. Given that the main sources of funding for this project are through debt and development charges, we felt it was prudent to look a little further into the impact on those two funding sources. So this is showing our debt capacity calculations, and this should look fairly familiar to council. This is an analysis we include in the budget book every year. The province does set a limit from a debt capacity perspective of debt payments not to exceed 25% of annual revenues, and that's represented by the red line at the top of the screen. The blue line, which actually extends right through from 2020 to 2032, represents the line that was shown as part of the 2021 budget. So that includes existing growth-related debt, existing non-growth related debt, as well as expected debt for new projects that were discussed as part of the 2021 budget, such as the groundwater investigation study that was passed as part of the most recent budget, a new well as part of the water supply master plan, the Dixon Drive servicing that we approved as part of the 2021 budget, the Fergus wastewater treatment plant expansion, a new fire hall as per the fire master plan, future parkland, and this does still include $500,000 for the operations center, which I believe was approved as part of the 2020 budget, but that is put on hold pending council's decision on this project. But the impact of that $500,000 is in the blue line. Now, taking into account the proposed new debt associated with the operations center, that shifts the blue line up to the orange line. So you can see our debt as a percentage of revenues does increase as a result of the proposed debt for the operations center, generally going up between 1 or 2% per year starting in 2024. So you can see how it does have an impact on our debt capacity, but we are still well below the 25% limit established by the province, and that does include all other proposed debt that we have included in the long-term forecast to date. And the final slide shows an analysis of development charges cash flow. So the bar chart, the stacked bar chart, is showing the different uses of development charges annually. The blue portion represents existing growth-related debt payments that we're making, and you can see how that gradually starts to reduce, and actually it eliminates just beyond the forecast period in the mid-2030s. The orange, the darkest orange color, is the internal debt we discussed as part of the council meeting on Monday of this week. So that's fairly minor in terms of impact on paying back that internal loan to the water capital reserve. The shady gray color is showing proposed new debt that is growth related, and that now includes what we're proposing as the proposed growth related debt for the operations center. And you can see how that increases over time. The green represents development charge credit payments, and this is where we've entered into a service finance agreement with a developer who has constructed growth-related capital for the township, and we're paying them back through annual DC credits. And then the The yellow represents the transfer to capital that we see as part of the capital budget every year to pay for growth-related debt in the capital budget. So you can see that roughly is $3.8 million in 2021. And with the proposed uses of DCs, it's proposed to increase by 2030 to about $7.7 million. You can see the three horizontal lines included on the graph in green, orange, and yellow. That represents historical DC proceeds received from growth, from development for the last 3 years. You can see we received roughly 5.5 million in 2020. The blue line that is increasing over time, starting at roughly 7 million in 2021, increasing to roughly 12 million by 2030, is the anticipated DC proceeds from the recently completed DC background study. You can see that has a fairly large increase anticipated in DC proceeds given anticipated growth within the township. And then given that in recent past, growth has typically come in roughly at 80% of what is proposed in the DC study. We showed that 80% line in purple as well. So you can see with the proposed DC proceeds, according to our DC study, as well as discounting that by 80%, we're still well within the range from a DC cash flow perspective to pay for the uses of DCs over the forecast period. That concludes the financing strategy, and I guess I'll turn the floor back over to Colin for next steps.
Great, thanks, Dan. So in terms of next steps, we're looking to finalize the report next month, May 2021, and then report back to council in June. And should council endorse option number 6, as Stephanie mentioned, that would commence a site selection process, and of course we would be reporting back to council on the outcomes of that process. We would anticipate reporting back in the fall of 2021. And once the site is secured, and we update the concept plan, commence detailed design for phase 1 and site servicing. So that would probably take most of 2022, and aim to have phase 1 kind of shovel ready by the end of 2022, I think would be a realistic goal. And that puts us in a good position. We are hearing of potential for post-COVID economic recovery grants being continued over the next couple of years. So, with this project kind of shovel ready, it would certainly be hopefully eligible for a future recovery grant from the province or the federal governments. And next slide, I think that's it. So just thanks very much to council for your attention and time this afternoon. We do have Rob Rosso and Dino Maziro and Kyle Davis, as well as the project team members, James, Jeff, Dan, of course, available to answer any questions that council may have. So with that, I think I'll hand it back to you, Barry Linton.
Wow. Thank you very much, staff. I have to say that was probably one of the most rigorous project presentations that I've ever seen. And I can imagine how much work went into this. So thanks very much, Colin. Thanks very much, Stephanie, Adam, James, Jeff. That was substantial, right from the conceptual design through to the phase implementation options and the evaluation, right over to the financing. So the purpose of today was really an information dump on council. Make sure that all the information is laid out, and get any initial questions or concerns or thoughts from councillors. We do have some time. There's lots of time before the comments can come in through our CAO from members of council to this, so you don't have to have everything figured out today, but we wanted to make sure that all this information was made available from start to finish today. So well, let's take a 5-minute break. I need one. And then we'll turn it over and we'll give councillors an opportunity to ask whatever questions that then have their comments ready when we get back. So we'll get back here. We'll be back here at 2:50, please. Okay, welcome back, council. Again, thanks staff for that very in-depth report. So discussion time. We'll start with Councillor Foster. Councillor Foster, your initial thoughts?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff and consultants, for a most interesting report. I have two primary questions today, Mayor, and just by confirmation to your remarks, Mayor, that today is an information dump, as you called it. We're not taking a decision today. I am correct in that?
You are correct in that. We'll be seeing this next in June.
That's right. Thank you, Mayor. So my question, first of all, I read the report in quite a bit of detail, and there's lots of references in there to operating cost savings. And being a cost accountant at heart, I'm looking for technical studies that demonstrate what the cost savings are. What I'm seeing are words like buzzwords like synergies and best practices and cost savings, but I'm not seeing any bona fide substantiated proof or demonstration of what the cost savings actually are going to be. And that concerns me a bit, thinking about driving a snowplow from Inverhaw to Bellwood is, perhaps 35 kilometers. We don't know the actual site, but my question, I think, then is where exactly are the operational savings? Where are the technical facts to prove that? For example, is this new garage going to reduce our payroll? Or where are these savings? I'm not seeing them in the report. That's my first question.
Yeah, it's I think page 20 talks about the different phases, and we're at the strategic phase. So I think a lot of those other things you're talking about is going to come in later phases, but I'll give staff an opportunity to respond if they'd like to that question. Colin, did you want to take a stab at it?
Sure. Through you, Mayor Linton. So in terms of cost savings, like we are expecting energy savings with a new modern facility that has proper insulation, that has more efficient heating and cooling, HVAC equipment installed in it. So we are anticipating cost savings with the phasing out of some of our existing dated facilities. So that are more expensive to run. They're block cinder walls. They're not well insulated, and single glass windows. As those facilities get phased out, we would be moving to this more energy efficient and energy efficient facility. In terms of other cost savings, we talked about just briefly just the operational savings, going to the kind of more decentralized model with the central hub and the two satellites. From staff's perspective, we do see that as a significant improvement in operations efficiency, where we can have equipment, staff, and vehicles kind of distributed throughout the township to reduce travel times and reduce, kind of downtime for staff and equipment traveling between sites. So really having the hub in Fergus, but then continuing to maintain the West Garifraxa site, as well as a presence in Elora, will help our operations be more efficient and productive. I don't know, James, if you had anything else to add from your perspective.
Yes, thank you, Colin. Well, as already said, I think it's too soon to identify detailed numbers. This is still very much strategic, conceptual, but typically what we would expect to see is that the current duplication of spaces across a number of different works garages would ultimately be eliminated, as we would look to eliminate those duplications and increase the utilization of space, but less space in a new operations center. So that, as well as just the general layout of facilities, as Jeff Miller was pointing earlier. Today, when we look at designing a new operations center, and Jeff, you may want to speak to this as well, but when looking at designing a new operations center, we're very much concerned with looking at the flow of vehicles, of people, trying to reduce travel distances, looking for efficiencies of space and how people maneuver around the site, where possible, incorporating lean manufacturing philosophies to eliminate labor costs and other operational costs. So there's a long list of issues that would be looked at and addressed as we get deeper involved in a more detailed plan. But certainly the expectation would be that a new operations center would help to achieve reduced operating costs, both facility and perhaps even labor, through increased productivity or the ability to use existing labor to achieve perhaps more higher service levels. I'll leave it at that. Jeff, was there anything you wanted to add to what I said?
I think you pretty much covered it. I would say, in terms of what the architectural and site design covers, really a better and more efficiently designed facility, a higher quality. I'm not just talking about finishes or anything like that, but a more a space and workplace that is designed specifically for the township and its way of working will naturally drive up the efficiency of workers and should result in a general increase in productivity. That's what we've seen in many cases.
Councillor Foster, second question, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a supplementary question to that and a second question, if I can. I'm not hearing anything substantial there. I'm hearing about energy and heating costs. Those are capital items. The Fergus East Garage, those things could have been addressed years ago, and they haven't for many years. I'm also not hearing anything in terms of location and the increased or any even technical response to the question of how that's going to impact operational costs, the main one of which is payroll. So I guess my question, supplemental to my first question, is will this have an impact on payroll costs? Will it reduce payroll costs? That's our main driver of costs.
Yeah, just the question that you answered before has been answered. This is about a facility project. So I outlined on page 20 the different project phases, and we're going from a needs assessment all the way down to a need for a facility to meet those needs. Operational costs are something that goes afterwards. So I think the answer to your first question has already been provided to the level it needs to be provided at this stage. So your second question is, Councillor Foster?
Thank you, Mayor. That's not a satisfactory answer, but nonetheless, I'll proceed to my second question. My second question for Dan Wilson is, Dan, regarding funding this project with DCs. You've told us that you'll find we're gonna term out the financing and make the payments with DCs. I have some concerns with that, Dan. Just on Monday, we talked about attainable housing, and we talked about reducing or even eliminating DCs in some cases to achieve the goal of attainable housing. Here we are 2 days later talking about financing a very, very large project with DCs. I don't think, Dan, we can assume, I mean, it's probable that this may happen, but we cannot assume over 10 or even 20 years that we can fund this with DCs. So my question then, Dan, is who pays for this project? Who services this debt if it turns out that DCs are not sufficient to pay for it? What's our plan B? Who pays for this if DCs can't pay?
Dan, go ahead, try to answer that question.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Linton. I guess My first comment is that is the purpose of a development charge background study. We have growth projections set by the province to grow to 52,000 people by 2041. And the DC study outlines both the growth related costs and the funding mechanisms to fund those costs over the forecast period. If growth is stalled or delayed in any way, we have, if we look at slide 61 of the presentation, where I looked at the different uses of development charges, a lot of those uses of DCs can also be delayed over time. The only fixed piece of DCs really is where you've incurred debt and you have to maintain the debt payments over time. But that's just one of the 5 uses of DCs on an annual basis. So if debt did slow down, then we would slow down our growth related initiatives to offset that.
Councillor Van Leeuwen?
Thanks, Mayor. I appreciate this report. It's quite an in-depth report. We've been speaking about this and seen it and have had it on our capital projects for so long. One of my concerns is the fact that that the growth or the cost of this continues to go up. I remember years ago looking at it, being shocked the cost of what it will take. And yet we know that the cost of building supplies, the cost of land, everything is growing astronomically. So I think that we do need to take a serious look at this. And yet in the same time, I appreciate that we're looking at it in a phased approach so that we can pull this back if we need to. Anyway, I look forward to a little more information as we go into the next steps as well, into more depth. But thanks for this report.
Councillor McElwain?
Thanks, Mayor. I also appreciate the report. It was in depth and well laid out and easy, reasonably easy to understand. A couple of questions though. First of all, do we have 20 acres of land anywhere in Center Wellington that is available and not adjacent to existing residential properties and meets the criteria, et cetera? Or are we looking at expanding the urban boundaries? Or I can't think of where we have that much land in Fergus.
Andy?
Thank you for the question, Councillor McElwain. So we'll get into more detailed discussions in a closed session with regards to properties and land and disposition of land. But there are some properties that the township staff have been looking at. But we'll get into those more in detail to be specifics, as those are more of a closed door session that we would come back to council with more detail.
Thanks, Sandy. My second question, it probably isn't the right day to ask them. It's probably a detailed question, but on the other hand, I think we're not going to be involved in the operational end of it too much. And so I was not upset, that's too strong a word, but disappointed, I guess, that the environmental issue was given such a low rating in the overall scheme of things. And given that we're looking at a 60-year time horizon, I would have thought environmental would be a much higher priority. And shouldn't we be looking at more lead type of initiatives and that type of thing? I guess I just environmental should, in my opinion, should be very high. I just noticed a few things like using natural gas instead of other sources of energy, and not necessarily sharing building operational systems with the IT system. And there's so many ways that intelligent buildings can be environmentally friendly, and I think we should be looking at them.
Thanks. I'll turn that to Colin to answer. Good question.
Great. Thanks, Mayor Linton. And I might get Jeff to help me out. He's the lead specialist on the team. So yeah, certainly that's something our project team kind of debated as to the weighting, but I think just in the overall scoring evaluation, I think it would have helped our options 6 through 8, or sorry, 5 through 8. It would have helped them score higher. They're brand new facilities. We have an opportunity to really incorporate sustainability into these features, and into these new facilities, whether it be solar, whether it be maybe it's ground source heating, maybe it's rainwater harvesting. Just on the tour that we did up in Mapleton for their new facility, they actually wash all their vehicles with water collected from the roof of the new facility. It's stored into a tank, and they use that for wash water instead of drinking water. So yeah, I think there's huge opportunities with a new facility to incorporate sustainability, low impact development as well. Something that we could be able to showcase at this new facility. But yeah, fair question, Councillor McElwain. Our project team, debated that issue as well in terms of that weighting. But I think overall it would still result in the same scoring. Jeff, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree with everything you said. I would add that many of the facilities we've designed have been LEED certified or shadowed LEED, or various approaches to that, up to a LEED Gold facility in Brampton. And I think that operation centers are very good places to invest in sustainability. They're pretty energy intensive facilities, so the energy savings that you can find can be very effective, and they're long lifespan facilities. So an investment, there's a chance to achieve really good paybacks over time.
Councillor McElwain?
Thanks, Mayor. As I say, there's all of those things can still be figured out how you're going to do it. Just the fact that it was had low influence in the criteria to begin with worries me that it's not going to have a high importance in the design, and so I would like to emphasize how important it is that we do the design with the environment in mind.
Councillor Kittrus?
Thank you, Mayor. Long awaited, 2 years, 2 budgets without this information, allocating money. And I guess on that note, I'm wondering what the full cost over the 2 years are of this report.
Does anybody have this at their fingertips? Otherwise, it can be something that you take away and get back to council afterwards. Dan, do you have that?
Yeah, through Mayor Linton, cost to date in the financial system is approximately 110,000.
Thanks, Dan. You have an additional question, Councillor Kittrus?
On, I think it was slide 2. Slide 2, there was a lot of staff and people on there, and I was wondering, for the operational center working group, I was wondering how many of those people were on the sunshine list.
That's out of scope. It's inappropriate question to ask. It's not at all part of this agenda, so that question is going to remain unanswered. Councillor Kittredge, do you have a question that has anything to do with the agenda today?
Yes, I do. I have many questions. Unfortunately, I'm only allowed to ask a few. On page,
you're allowed to answer the questions that are on the agenda, so please stick to that.
On page 50, there is a collaborative project with Mapleton and the county, and it shows that it is 2019, and the costs are quite low. And I know there were some questions about the land here, but we own 70 to 80 acres. We just purchased a whole industrial property thing. And the county owns land in the center of the municipality. I want to ask, I guess it's Mr. James, about the evaluation scoring process. And I'm wondering who comes up with the scoring and the weighting of all that. Because we've had this before for the digester roof, and it seems that the scoring is manipulated to get the result that we want, that the staff wants. So I'm just wondering who created that scoring tablet.
Can I talk about the terminology that's being used, Councillor Kittredge? Please refrain from using words like manipulating. This is a professional project using professional consultants and using professional staff. They went through evaluation criteria. Do you have any specific issues with the evaluation criteria itself, or do you have to focus on the people involved in creating the criteria? Is there any questions of substance here?
Yes, I'm wondering how they came up with it. I just asked that.
You didn't ask it that way, and if that's your question, that's a fine question, and I'll turn it over to Colin to respond to it.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Linton. Yeah, so the evaluation criteria, I know James went through that in a fair bit of detail in his presentation, and we as staff and the consultants try to be unbiased in terms of our evaluation and scoring. So we're just trying to look at this as anyone would. But if there's specific concerns with a particular score, we'd be happy to hear them out and provide feedback. But yeah, unless James, you wanted to provide an overview on the evaluation criteria and how that was established, if you have anything to add to that.
Yes, thank you, Colin. Well, first of all, to try to reassure council, we do take an unbiased approach to our projects and try to bring to the project our experience and understanding, having worked with many municipalities for the conceptual design of new operations centers, and we have an understanding of what many of the issues were with other municipalities. And so we sat down, and in particular me, with key members of staff that included Stephanie and Colin, and tried to identify what we thought were these key categories of concern, and then to break those categories down into more detailed criteria that we thought would be of relevance, of importance to council, to the residents of the township, and then try to also estimate, the weighting or the priority of importance of each of these criteria, as I said in the presentation. And then, having established that structure, went through and tried to, in an unbiased way, fairly and as accurately as possible, tried to assign a score to each one of the options for each one of the criteria. And we didn't have any, real objective other than to see how the cards fell and what the final numbers would be. I think I can say that the results of the evaluation didn't surprise us, and in a way that provided us some comfort. We thought everything seemed reasonable. It's what we kind of were expected, that the do nothing approach, which doesn't in really any way try to address the problem, was going to come in with the lowest score. And to look at building a new operations center with all of the benefits that come with that would likely be the preferred approach. Really, the question was, how would the different phasing approaches impact the final scores? And in the end, we concluded, as said in the presentation, that regardless of which type of phasing we looked at, the scores were all relatively close to each other. So I think this analysis, it was an attempt to be rigorous, to be unbiased, to look at what council and the residents of the township would value, to look at how these different options would impact the operations, the productivity, the safety of the operations, the compliance with legislation, even looking at sustainability issues, although perhaps, as pointed out earlier, those sustainability issues could be raised in terms of weighting and importance, but the end result, I think, would have been the same. And even if there was some, subtle nudging or changing to some of our numbers, I think the end general conclusions would remain the same: to proceed with a new operations center on a new site that would be large enough to safely and efficiently handle all of the operations in the future. The question becomes, how best do you phase it? And that's something that doesn't need to be decided now. It can be thought through in the next year or two to best meet the needs of operations, of council, of the availability of funding. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Councillor Dunsmore?
Yeah, let me begin by saying I appreciate the professionalism with which this study was conducted and the in-depth report and the work that's gone into it. And I do not share Councillor Kitchers's suggestion that you fudged the numbers or manipulated them for your own goals here. I remember when we first came on council and we took a tour of a lot of the buildings that our staff are working in. And I can probably guess without, we don't have our HR person here, but I'm pretty sure that in our public works department, the people who drive the plows and the trucks and work on those vehicles, we probably don't have a lot of women in there. And it's not because they're not good mechanics, and it's not because they don't want to drive the trucks. We can't even provide them with a change room and a bathroom. Those buildings were built in the 1950s, and to Councillor McElwain's point about the environment, those buildings, to even get them to be environmentally efficient, would probably cost tens of millions of dollars. So this is something that growth has created and neglect from previous councils about the maintenance and the repairs of these buildings. And the time has come to do something about it. And I appreciate the efforts that have gone through. So I really don't have any other questions other than the fact that I would like to ask staff, and Colin, perhaps it's you. You mentioned in the report about working with the county, and that the county was 15 years away from doing anything of this. And then I see in the report that we are going to be 1 to 10 years on or 5 to 10 on the before the first phase is done, and 10 plus years beyond the second one. So I'm wondering if, while we're putting together the final stages of this, if there is room for consulting with the county to say, if we had a big enough swath of land, or if they have a swath of land that we may end up using in the end, and we purchased it big enough, is there a way to bring synergies with the county to have them eventually come out here? And I do know we share a mechanic with them. I remember that report a while back where we were sharing a heavy machinery mechanic with all the townships. But it seems to me that the county would have a card to play here if we left space for them, and we could maybe recuperate some of our costs down the road. So those are my only comments, Your Worship.
Colin?
Through Mayor Linton, thanks, Councillor Dunsmore. Yeah, certainly, we've had a number of discussions with the county and explored opportunities. I think, once we get into that 10 to 20 year time frame and phase two, we'll certainly be needing to make a decision on the Elora side of things. They have expressed interest, that they would, in the expansion, they have, or usually theirs is less expansion, but more replacement of existing facilities, that they would likely be replacing the site in Elora. And certainly, we would be at the table with them, seeing if there's any opportunities for efficiencies at that stage too. But I think that would be more focused on kind of the Elora spoke of operations, as opposed to impacting the larger facility. So we do, like, at some point, I think it makes sense to consolidate the Pilkington office here and the Elora site. And, we can certainly be exploring, I think, at that time, discussions with the county to see if there's any opportunities when they're ready to start looking at it.
Councillor McCray?
Thank you, Mary Lynn. I'd just like to say to the consultants and staff, thank you very much for a very informative report. It's interesting to see what is involved in designing a centralized facility. I mean, it's for those of us who may not have been involved with it, it certainly gives you an overview and appreciation of all the steps involved to actually building something. It reminds me as well as the firm that I retired from. We went through a similar process, and it was interesting to see similar considerations being given to what we actually built for our staff. The question I have is, given the fact we're looking at a 20-acre property, and there's talk of building another fire hall, has there been any consideration given to having the new fire hall on the same property as the operations center?
I think Andy would like to speak to that one.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor McCray. We have had those discussions internally, and those are options that we will be looking at as we proceed. The challenge that may have the main key deciding point is response time for the future fire hall. The location we were looking at was more sort of kind of the just Beatty Line area, given that our two stations are on the south side at the kind of the eastern and westerly ends. So it was something more central that we're looking at from a response time for there, but it is something that we do have on our consideration of this or any other facility that we have planned in the future for the joint location that we might be able to look at.
Thanks, Andy. Anything else, Councillor McCray?
No, just I guess curiosity is the water filling station that's shown at the bottom of the map. Would that be a place where a fire truck could go up and fill in a hurry, or is that more for our own equipment or people wanting to buy water to put in pools?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Thanks, Marilyn. So through you, yeah, it's a bulk water, so it's a service we provide typically to contractors working in the area, and so yeah, if you'll go to our Queen Street Water Services facility, and Dino can attest that at 7 a.m. in the morning on Queen Street, there's quite often a line of contractor vehicles, heavy equipment lined up on Queen Street, waiting to get bulk water for their projects, and so it could be associated with anything to do with the construction. The fiber installation that's going on through the community has resulted in a large demand for bulk water, as well, as those directional drills require bulk water. And yeah, definitely, we'll get the odd request for a tanker to be filled for a swimming pool, that's getting topped up or filled. That's new. So it's definitely a well-used service that we have, and by incorporating it into the new site, new facility, it's a much again, safer arrangement for these large trucks and tankers that are pulling into our parking lots where staff are currently parked, and it's just very crammed and tight. But that's the purpose, is to get that within the road, much safer arrangement, and and provide the contracting industry with a bulk water option, and for fire as well. I think fire. Rob would know this better than I would, but I believe they fill up at the fire halls before they leave. So their tankers are typically kind of on the ready, as opposed to having to travel to one of our bulk water sites to fill up. So
Great, thanks, Colin. Thanks, councillors, for some of those initial comments. I just wanted to make a couple of comments myself. This is something that has been very needed for a long time, and the reason why we put it in the strategic plan. Thanks to the team for spending some time identifying the current deficiencies that we have, because they're substantial. And it doesn't take too many tours of the current facilities to recognize that we have significant issues there. Not everything that we do is about cost savings. We have to make an investment into this community, especially when it comes to the delivery of our core services. And what we're talking about here is effective delivery of core services, not just now, but for years to come. And there comes a time when councils have to make big decisions on things that are going to impact the delivery of those core services. So I like the way this project was laid out. It started with a very, very clear and persuasive case for change. The deficiencies were well laid out. And it drove right through to the design. What do we need currently? What are we going to need by 2041? And then looking at the financial modeling. How can we do this in a way that reduces the impact on the taxpayer and allows us to use development fees and a balanced use of debt financing? So we have something really, really good to work with, and it's a little disappointing to me that members of council sometimes don't recognize an excellent report when it's staring them in the face, because this is an excellent report. The methodology for this project is very rigorous, and this is the kind of report that councils are asking for. It lays everything out. Obviously, all the detail isn't there yet, because that's the nature of driving to detail. You have to identify what you need before you get the detail. So I think the majority of us recognize that. You have to drive from vision to strategy into options, and then get the operational detail after that. I think most of us are clear on that process. So thanks for the report, and thanks for the initial comments from members of council. I would suggest that members of council get to our CAO any additional comments, thoughts, suggestions, ideas that you have. If you could get them to our CAO by May the 10th, that'll give our staff enough time to turn things around in order to have a draft back to council in the June timeframe. And obviously there's a lot of discussions that will have to happen. This was, again, an original information dump for council to make sure that you're aware of the project and the different options and the evaluation criteria and the recommended option for that have been put forward by staff. So that's kind of the approach that we'll take, okay? Any last comments from members of council before we accept this for information? Councillor Kittrus?
Thank you, Mayor. I do understand that this project for $110,000 is very detailed and comprehensive. But I actually tried to crunch some of the numbers from the data that it had for option 3. And I believe that at this time of COVID, where there is job insecurity, housing insecurity, just 48 hours ago, we heard about it, and we need funding for that. And I don't believe that growth should pay for a Taj Mahal. I believe that we need to build development charges fund, a special fund for this. Over time, we need to have a strategic relationship, shared services and cooperative with the county. And I believe that if you look at the numbers there, for option one was 4.02 million to do nothing. And then if you take the $37 million from the 41 and you split that to share the cost like Mapleton did for their facility, that means half of that cost would be ours. And if you saved through DC charges over time and created a fund and did the small repairs over time, you would be talking about $600,000 to $700,000 per year over time, which would be feasible instead of borrowing for a $27 million Taj Mahal. And so I think we need to step back in these times and look strategically. You know, Mapleton, they have zero increased budgets. They seem to be able to cooperate with the county very well. And I think we should learn from them and use those strategic path going forward.
Any other comments from members of council? Councillor Foster?
Thank you, Mayor. There was a technical glitch. I believe you called me.
Yeah,
Tested.
Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Mayor. I have asked two fairly straightforward questions, and I haven't gotten an answer. My first question was, you know, all this talk about operation cost savings, our main driver of operating costs is wages. And I asked a very straightforward question and I didn't get an answer, which is, will this project help reduce payroll costs? I asked a second question about the financing, a very straightforward question. Dan, you really didn't answer my question, which is, who will service the debt if DCs are insufficient? And you didn't answer my question. As I said earlier, this is all predicated on synergies, buzzwords. There's assertions of cost savings, but there's nothing concrete in this report that proves that cost savings will indeed occur. And on that basis alone, this report is not sufficient to make a $27 to $28 million decision. And while I do appreciate the report, it's hard to support it when it does not have any bona fide technical studies that show exactly how costs will be saved, just a vague assertion that they will. Finally, I want to point out that the Fergus East Garage was built in the 80s. All through the last 15 years, almost no maintenance has been done. The roof has been leaking for 8 to 10 years and was done to fix it. So now we're asserting that it's not a good building, and yet we did nothing to maintain it over the years. And that troubles me as well. We could easily improve that building. We have nothing in this report that talks about the details of option 1 or 2 or 3. I think we could achieve considerable savings by fixing rather than replacing, and expanding the size of rather than buying land and building new. And what troubles me is there's nothing in the report to even consider it. So I do have some concerns about that report on those primary 3 matters.
Any other questions from council, comments from council before we receive this information, for information? Okay, I'll read the recommendation that the Council of the Township of Center Wellington receive as information the draft report and presentation of the findings of the Operations Center Space Needs Assessment, Evaluation of Alternatives, and Concept Plan Study. Can I get a mover for that, please? Councillor McCray, seconded by Councillor Dunsmore. All in favor? Opposed? And that is carried. Thanks very much again for the whole team. This is a really good report. Council has everything that we need to make some big decisions. This is not an easy project. It's a tough project, and it's a substantial project. So thanks for the detail, thanks for the order, and thanks for the whole team coming to the table to present to council today. Really, really appreciate it. With that, can I have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Kittredge, seconded by Councillor Van Leeuwen. All in favor? And we will adjourn, and some of you will see at a public meeting at 6 o'clock. See you later.